regarding FM radio, now, the bands have tried, in reference, Clear Channel Fuck Off by Leftover Crack, tried very much so to surmise what happened, and it alludes to it in its lyrical form. But what happened was, it's documented, and some public broadcast universities refer to it as the tragedy in 1996, under the very strange logic and twisted logic of the time period. Congress had, this idea, and it was very easy to foresee, this turning into a disaster, and the disaster that it did. I mean, it's like, looking back on it through, the lens of history, yeah, of course we can rewind and see that it was a mistake, but it also, you didn't need foresight to know that this was going to end the way that it did. You weren't some kind of genius if you did this. There were limits on how much and how many, and also if you owned like a TV station, you didn't get to own a radio station. There were regulations like that on the number of stations that could be owned by one company. And the Telecommunications Act was based on this very weird, twisted Orwellian logic that basically stipulated that, if there are all these new technologies and everything with the internet and internet radios coming along and all this, we're on the cusp of a technological revolution that changes, everything. And we were, a lot of people saw it. The internet was the next big up and coming thing at the time and everything. It was starting to really take off at that point. The commercialization, Steve Case was, salting the earth in free trials to AOL, which was doing really well at the time, if you recall, and everything. And, it eventually fell off the earth, for whatever reason. Anyways, so this is all going on, and, in the context of this, they struck down they struck down the limits on how much one station could, one company could own and how many stations they could own, and totally deregulated it and everything under this very strange, I don't know how they fucked this one up, because I mean, the idea was that this would increase competition, when obviously allowing one player to own everything would just encourage consolidation, and down to the two players that we have today, from like the 50 it was back, or more, that it was back in the day, an obviously superior situation to what we find ourselves in now and everything. And it due to iHateRadio's, capture of almost the entire American market, for one thing, nobody was able to be located to broadcast to Minute, North Dakota, when there was a train derailment with leaking toxic fumes and everything. The alert mechanisms broke down at that time and everything. And, iHeartRadio did a terrible job of, they didn't even interrupt broadcast locally for it, because the whole thing had been set up to broadcast one stream to the entire country. But then, on top of that, as they managed to gobble up, broadcast space and more of it, their quality went down. And, if the singer Jewel, the one that wrote Hands and Who Will Save Your Soul and all that stuff, yeah, her career never would have gotten off the ground under the current, administration of radio as a medium, because it got taken over by a bunch of moneybags that didn't really care about anything other than the moolah and everything, and only saw, the radio as a way to make a lot of it. It got taken over by finance bros, and so nobody in that sphere, really loves music the way that music buffs do. It's just not a thing. The passion isn't there. What they love is money, and so this infestation has been going on for a long time. And the one thing that drives me the most crazy is that, like, the broadcast spectrum for the most part belongs to either iHeartRadio or Cumulus, and we're in a duopoly state, right, with the whole thing. But if you see our iHeartRadio in your city, the chances are very low that you're going to see a Cumulus station at all in your city at all. If you have even one, they aim to own the entire broadcast spectrum in every city, and in response to the drop off of viewership that happened as a result of like cyberspace and everything, they decreased variety on the stations, and so they've become a terrible way to expose yourself to new music and everything, and to find anything new that is, tailored to your taste and everything. And so Pandora, became the better option and everything, because it just, at least you can flip Pandora into discovery mode, and it's not going to keep showing you what you've already heard. It's going to try to go for things that you're unfamiliar with. And everything. And, so this is happening, and, they take up almost everything. And the thing that drives me the most crazy is that, they'll try to argue, that because of the existence of Cumulus, that they're not a monopoly, and even if they were to buy up Cumulus and everything, and the FTC and the FCC got out of their way, they would try to use internet radio, which is a tiny footprint compared to their broadcast spectrum, in terms of, listenership and everything, and the power that they still have to this day. Yes, unfortunately, if you are a viewer to the station, FM radio is still a thing. Terrestrial radio has tragically not died the death that it deserves to die. And I know that I'm laughing, but I'm horrified by all of this. But, black humor obviously is a thing for me. I find it one of the only ways to cope with the horror that is the situation, to keep from crying, about all of it, But what really pisses me off is that, we saw under the Biden administration a new era of antitrust enforcement, but they only went after big tech. What about big radio? Why didn't you go after them, in particular? And I think that a lot of it is that Congress still doesn't recognize this, because it lives in this bubble of delusional garbage that, an out-of-touch Washingtonian, fantasy that, the mere existence of internet radio and Cumulus somehow negates the monopoly argument. The fact that there are two players in the radio business means somehow that it's not a monopoly, or that there's any difference in terms of quality, of product. They think that at least Cumulus exists so that it basically increases quality, but Cumulus doesn't, because Cumulus only exists in the markets it exists in. It doesn't cross-pollinate with iHateRadio. So if you live in a city that's within the range of a broadcaster, your only option is going to be one player or the other, because they don't compete in each other's markets. It's like the way that there have been backroom deals apparently between Comcast and Time Warner, where they've agreed with each other to not interfere in each other's territory or step on each other's toes. And so they've carved up the landscape, and that's been really good for them, but it's been terrible for everybody else and everything. And the same thing is happening in the world of FM radio. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm all for the FCC and FTC, greenlighting a merger between Cumulus and iHateRadio and pushing them together and the consolidation down to one, because at least it eliminates one counter argument to the to going after them under the Sherman Antitrust Act. But as it stands, we would have to argue that they monopolize the FM spectrum, under that situation, and that they own entirely too much, and they've become a monopoly, and everything. And that we're not saying that they have a complete monopoly on broadcast, but they do have it over FM broadcast, and own almost the entire, spectrum and everything, and have shut out and have engaged in anti-competitive behavior by just buying up, and sucking up all their fucking competitors and, driving them out of business. See, I hate radio. I hate iHeart. I haven't forgotten that they just nim shifted from, they just nim shifted from Clear Channel. You can call yourself iHeartRadio all you want, but you're still fucking Clear Channel to me, bitch. Fuck you. Anyways, about these monopolistic parasites, these bottom-feeding scumbags that run this shit, and have run our FM spectrum into the ground, in this country and everything, and have destroyed it, and the quality of its broadcast and everything. And I'm not the only one that thinks this. This is one of the reasons why talk radio exists in the first place, because everybody fucking hates the music they broadcast. Anyways, Jules never would have taken off because it's one national syndicated broadcast, and her career famously got off the ground because a DJ in one city thought his city would resonate with her music and decided to take a chance on her and put her on the airwave, and it did. He was in touch with his city's vibe and its people, and it took off and off the ground, and pretty soon it, became national. Everybody was listening to it after that, like. She never would have succeeded in the current landscape because there's one, national player, and then there are people that are agents that bounce between the record labels and everything, and tell them what to play and what to spin and all this other shit. It's it's all corporatized and pay to play and everything. And if you want to get your name out there as a musician, you're pretty much paying some promoter to put your shit on the radio. Even to this day, it's crazy. Like you would think that the internet changed things, but even the curated playlist on Spotify are often completely, payola, and everything. And we use this term like very loosely because, it could be hookers and blow, or it could be, concert tickets, video game consoles, just anything that had value and was desirable is often used as a medium to bribe these people. And so, they often use the end product itself because that, eliminates a paper trail and everything and makes it much more difficult to prove, in a court of law how this happened and how you came into possession of this particular, item. So it may just be concert tickets to take your girlfriend to or whatever as the station owner. And, so this has been going on for a long time. Congress has investigated the music industry 6 separate times, and every single time they've found them guilty of, running a payola scheme and everything, and there's no reason to think that they'll have changed their act the 7th time. Did you know that? Congress has investigated 6 separate fucking times. But anyways, it was obvious, everything that happened under the 1996 Telecommunications Act was thoroughly predictable. That's what gets me. You didn't need foresight to realize what was going to happen. You strike down the broadcast limits. Obviously, there are going to be players that are interested in consolidation. You're not going to increase competition. What your bill is going to do is all but destroy it. So the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was promoted as this idea that it was going to free up the broadcasters to compete with each other and everything, but the plain language of the bill struck down the broadcast limits and allowed one player to own almost everything. And it's almost like, what could possibly go wrong? This was all thoroughly predictable. In fact, there were people at the time that before the bill passed that were warning us, and they have been proven right about this situation. This was a disastrously stupid decision, and goddamn Bill Clinton for not vetoing it. A piece of shit leader. Anyways, Cumulus and iHateRadio own almost the entire spectrum in this country, and they have ruined it. FM radio is a shadow of its former self and former glory. It sucks today. The thing is that music hasn't actually dramatically declined in quality. What has declined in quality is the old methods for discovering it. That's the reality of the situation. Now, the whole trouble with the current arrangement with iHateRadio owning like hundreds and hundreds of stations all up and down the country, often in many locales, owning every station in town, is that they'll use the mere existence of Cumulus to say that we don't have a monopoly, and so we're not subject to the Sherman Antitrust Act, and even if they did or were allowed to buy them up, they'll try to use the mere existence of internet radio to argue that they don't have a monopoly. at all, and that they face unprecedented, competition from every angle and everything. But see, the thing is, the mere existence of Cumulus does nothing to make iHeartRadio higher quality. They exert almost no competitive pressure on them and everything, and it would make literally zero difference for the terrible experience I have listening to FM radio, no matter where I go on the dial. It would make literally no difference to the quality if we would just allowed iHeartRadio to scoop up everything that Cumulus owns. It would be the same terrible shit tier quality that the rest of the that of a monopoly. And that's what gets me, is that you may say that quantitatively, as far as the quantity of what they own, they don't own absolutely everything, but quality wise, the difference, it makes no difference at all. A duopoly might as well be a monopoly. It's no better in terms of all the problems of monopoly are every bit as bad under a duopoly situation. It is improved. It improves things not even the slightest, not even the tiniest fraction of things, not even by the different, the width of a fucking human hair. It doesn't improve anything. It is 0 followed by a point followed by an infinite progression of 0% better than a monopoly. Literally, absolutely, not a shred, not even the tiniest fraction of a percentage better than a monopoly. So I'm basically scorched earth, done with this shit. I find myself troubled, and unable to wrap my head around the idea that anybody back in 1996 was stupid enough to believe that this would increase competition. I mean, how naive and simplistically stupid do you have to be to believe shit like that? And I know that I have the benefit of hindsight in this situation, and that there may be some hindsight bias and everything, but the truth of the matter is, like I said, there were people even back then who warned us.